Hey there. Before we begin tonight's story, make sure to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, grab a warm drink, and if you enjoy falling into forgotten corners of history, stories told quietly, like whispers from the past, then go ahead and tap subscribe and gently press like so this tale finds its way to others drifting through the night. No loud intros, no distractions, just you, the story, and the distant echo of a time long gone. Let's begin. So you've clicked on a video about medieval assassins. Let's get one thing straight. They weren't glamorous, heroic, or rich. They were peasants with knives dreaming of survival more than glory. Imagine being so desperate that sneaking through alleys with a stolen dagger in your belt felt like a better choice than starving. No training, no pensions, no backup plan. Just you hoping the job doesn't leave you hanging, literally. Tonight we're unraveling why stepping into the shoes of a medieval assassin was more curse than career. Imagine starving so badly that murder starts to look like a paycheck. Grain prices rise, crops fail, and entire villages go hungry. Your belly gnaws at you day and night, and the only thing thinner than your body is the list of options you have for survival. Work the fields again even though the harvest won't feed you. Beg in the market and earn little more than insults, or do what others whisper about. Kill who you're told to kill and hope at the end of it you get a crust of bread or a pouch of coins. It's not a dream job, it's barely a job at all. But in a world where poverty pressed down harder than steel armor, killing for pay could feel like the only exit door you had left open. Now, if you think this line of work created a class of slick, calculating professionals who moved like shadows, step away from the movie screen. The men who took this path rarely did so because of ambition. They stumbled into it because of desperation. Peasants, for instance, had almost no safety net if life turned against them. A bad harvest left them with nothing but weakened bodies and debts they could never hope to repay. And once debts came due, lords didn't show much patience. You didn't get bankruptcy papers, you got thrown off the land. That meant wandering hungry through cities overflowing with migrants just like you, all scraping for the same tiny scraps of labor. In that street chaos, someone might whisper an opportunity, with a knife instead of a plow. Ex-soldiers filled out the assassin pool too, but not because they planned it. Wars ended suddenly or dragged on until kingdoms went bankrupt and armies broke apart overnight. A soldier who pledged his life to a banner ended up with nothing but a patched cloak, a worn blade, and scars that didn't pay for food. Some drifted into mercenary bands, but when even princes stopped hiring swords, other offers began to appear in tavern corners. Quiet proposals delivered with a lowered voice. This man should not live past next week. There's coin if you can make it happen. The soldier's training might give him an edge, but more often than not, it was just the desperation of needing coin that shoved him toward criminal work. And then came the small-time criminals themselves, pickpockets and burglars whose tricks stopped covering their hunger. The leap from robbing purses to stabbing targets seems enormous, but hunger shrinks the gap real fast. A thief already knows shadows, alleys, and flight routes. Add a blade and suddenly people imagine him useful for darker errands. But useful doesn't mean skilled. Skill was rare. Hunger was common. What forced men into this trade wasn't the ability to kill cleanly, but the willingness to gamble on it. Compare this reality with every picture painted in fantasy tales. Elite members of hidden brotherhoods, their lives brimming with rituals, codes, and grand ambitions. The real thing was mostly villagers who failed at ordinary life. They had no secret handshakes, no ancient libraries of poison recipes. They barely had boots to keep water off their feet. You don't join a guild. You stumble into a tavern one night and come out with a task you're not sure you can even manage. Glory doesn't figure into it. Survival does. The setting behind it all was misery on a national scale. Famine ripped through medieval Europe more than once. An unlucky harvest didn't just make food prices high, it meant bodies in the streets. A starving man will eat bark, weeds, or the dried skin off old leather. When that fails, he'll sell his labor for pennies, or worse, sell his blade for blood. Whole families uprooted themselves to chase rumors of work in cities. And once they arrived, those cities swallowed them in crowded lanes where thousands of outsiders competed for servant jobs or construction wages. The unlucky ones didn't get hired, and slowly the line between staying honest and crossing into danger blurred. When war ended, misery didn't. Soldiers trudged home to find their villages couldn't afford another feeding mouth, and returning home with weapons didn't guarantee respect. Many were seen as a burden, or worse, as a threat. A man who knew how to fight but had nothing to lose attracted suspicion. Employers avoided him, neighbors avoided him. Loneliness cracked down, and when loneliness joined hunger, the road opened wider toward selling violence. But notice what isn't there. No guild of assassins waiting at the edge of the forest to welcome new recruits. No pension fund to assure you a quiet death at 50. If you failed at the fields, failed to secure regular work, failed to get picked up by a mercenary captain, then your only safety net was the fact someone somewhere wanted a rival gone and was too cowardly to do it themselves. That created opportunities, yes, but crude and short-lived ones. Even criminals themselves lived at the edge of ruin. In many towns, punishment for minor theft could include losing an ear or a hand. So if you already wore punishments carved into your skin, jobs dried up even faster. An earless man couldn't work most markets, or hide easily if guards looked for him. Once all legal paths closed, the illegal ones widened in response, and murder for pay became the last refuge of people who had run out of other lies to tell themselves. It was never a first choice. It was often the final corner they backed themselves into. If you were starving in one of those years when wheat failed, you noticed how thin grain soups became. Bread loaves shrank until a family shared one crust. Winter nights stretched with only smoke-blackened walls and damp straw for warmth. Rats scurried nearby, competing for the same crumbs as you. Against that backdrop, anyone promising a small pouch of coins or even the promise of meat afterward had your attention. Even if what they wanted from you meant striking someone dead in a marketplace or slipping into a dark corridor with a kitchen blade strapped to your leg. Ambition didn't fuel this. It wasn't about fame, skill, or honor. It was about gritting your teeth and swallowing the thought. Better his life than mine. You weren't remembered for success. You weren't guaranteed safety if you pulled it off. You were just temporarily less hungry. For most of these desperate men, the concept of a career never entered their heads. Theirs was not an organized trade. It was a survival mechanism sparked by famine, sharpened by unemployment, and paid for with every shred of comfort that normal life once offered. No priest blessed their work. No lord openly advertised for them. You shuffled into crime with the same hesitation a man might feel before jumping off a ledge into unknown water. Once you jumped, there was no ladder back up. Only forward toward fear, shadow, and silence. Becoming an assassin wasn't so much a choice as it was the end of all other choices. It was what you did when the plow left you with nothing. The landlord expelled you, the tavern refused you, and starvation tapped you awake each night with its hollow knuckles. It was an exit plan you never wanted, but sometimes the last plan you had left. And in the quiet moments before a job, when your stomach churned louder than your conscience, you couldn't help but wonder one thing. If you never had a teacher, if you never had a guide, then how were you supposed to even know the right way to kill? Forget training montages. Most assassins had none. No dimly lit chamber where a hooded master whispered secrets, no parchment manuals filled with diagrams of pressure points, no ceremonial oath bonding novices into brotherhoods of the night. If you were unlucky enough to find yourself pointed toward this life, your training ground was the mud of the city street. Whatever scrap of skill you held didn't come from structured lessons. It came from stealing apples, throwing fists outside a tavern, or swinging spear on a battlefield you were forced into before your beard even grew. And even then, none of that taught you the thing you most needed, which was how to take a life quickly, quietly, and without ending up trampled by guards seconds after. Think about a street thief. His day-to-day craft was light fingers and quick legs. Slip the purse, run before the victim knew what happened. That skill doesn't translate well when the task shifts from stealing coins to stopping a heartbeat. Imagine that same thief pushed by hunger into trying his first killing. He stalks his target, heart-hammering blade tucked under a ragged sleeve. In stories, he presses the dagger forward and silence follows. In reality, stabbing is loud. Metal glances off bone, men cry out, blood sprays across fabric that's impossible to wash. Guards hear, bystanders panic. The so-called silent kill turns into a chaotic mess of shouts and boots clattering in pursuit. That was the graduate lesson in this world. The painful discovery that no one ever taught you the difference between imagination and reality. And in this business, the cost of ignorance was usually death. Now you, listening comfortably in your bed, might picture some hidden society opening its doors to train these would-be killers like some twisted guild of craftsmen. It's a compelling image, but more fantasy than fact. Secret societies didn't appear to guide peasants into this bloody occupation. What appeared were amateurs fumbling with borrowed knives, improvising in alleys, learning from each clumsy mistake. Except the tutors weren't patient mentors. They were disasters unfolding in real time. One failed strike and the assassin was dragged into the street by townsfolk who had no interest in sympathy. Execution, not encouragement, followed. So the curriculum was short and brutal. You either taught yourself to survive by a mix of luck and instinct, or you made one unrecoverable mistake. It's worth pausing here to picture the tools themselves. Forget sleek daggers forged specifically for the job. Often the blade in question was nothing more than a cooking knife pried from a kitchen, or a blacksmith's file sharpened crudely against stone. Sometimes even farming tools, sickles, axes, pitchforks, were turned into instruments of makeshift crime. The tools reflected their owners, desperate, poor, and using whatever was at hand. A soldier discarded from an army might at least own a sword, but maintaining that weapon required coin he didn't have. So rusted edges, chipped steel, and dull points all featured heavily in these jobs. Imagine trying to kill quickly with a blunt tool. It prolongs the act, increases the struggle, draws attention, and magnifies every risk. Far from polished artistry, it was sweaty, clumsy bloodletting. The absence of manuals only made matters worse. In other trades, apprentices learned by shadowing older workers. You could stand at a carpenter's bench and watch cuts measured and sand applied. You could kneel beside a mason and observe mortar mixed just right. In this trade, there were no open demonstrations. You didn't watch someone kill, then repeat the steps under guidance. At best, you might hear stories in taverns, whispers describing poison slipped into a wine cup or a dagger pushed through ribs from behind. But stories don't convey reality. A tale of clean stabbing ignores the resistance of muscle, the unpredictability of victims thrashing, the way chaos spreads instantly once the act begins. So you weren't really learning. You were gambling, hoping to improvise faster than circumstance could unravel. Some assassins drifted in from soldiering, and those men at least had experience with weapons. But battlefield fighting and murder in a marketplace were two entirely different worlds. On a battlefield, noise reigned supreme, orders shouted, banners waving, shields crashing. You struck amid a sea of distractions. Killing a rival soldier didn't require silence. In fact, noise was cover. But in the alley or Lord's Hall, one slip meant a crowd turned its eyes toward you. A sword swing honed on a battlefield became clumsy when confronted with a single target who screamed in a stone corridor. So while training in military life may have given someone muscles and practice in violence, it did not prepare them for stealth, and stealth was everything here. Luck played just as big a role as muscle or blade. Survival didn't hinge on impeccable skill, but on whether the right door happened to be ajar, whether a passing patrol chose one street over another, whether the victim was drunk enough not to resist strongly. Many so-called successful jobs probably succeeded as much by fortune as by planning. A glass of ale falling at the right time to drown out a noise, a crowd bursting into laughter while covering a cry, or rain starting suddenly and muffling footfalls. These tiny accidents could mean the difference between slipping away unnoticed or being hunted within moments. In that sense, an assassin's most trusted ally wasn't his weapon, it was randomness. The strategies themselves often looked crude from the outside. Grab whatever tool you had, hide it under a cloak, and lunge when the chance appeared. Or shove a poisoned scrap of food onto a plate and pray the right person ate it. No arched rooftops, no choreographed leaps. Just rough attempts made in darkness or confusion. In tight medieval towns, alleys provided cover but also trapped you like a rat if chased. Escaping through them required knowing the twisting turns better than the guards, and even then, a wrong turn down a narrow passage meant doom. Planning, therefore, was limited by both ignorance and poverty. Elaborate schemes were luxuries. Most killings were blunt force attempts dashed off under pressure. All of this leaves an interesting question. If tools were crude and skills half-baked, then how did anyone manage to get close to powerful targets at all? Nobles weren't wandering in marketplaces unguarded. Landowners barricaded themselves in halls with gatekeepers and watchful servants. An amateur assassin trying to reach such a person carried the odds stacked steeply against him. He wasn't armed with elaborate instruction. He was armed with desperation, a knife that wasn't sharp enough, and luck measured in fleeting seconds. And those fleeting seconds shaped every step. There was no rehearsal, no multiple tries. A botched attempt ended in claws of guards tearing you down. The cost of a mistake wasn't embarrassment, it was capture, torture, display in public squares. That fact hovered over every job. So much so that the job itself wasn't really about skill, but about gambling one roll of dice where the penalty for rolling wrong was as final as it gets. So the training most assassins received wasn't really training at all. It was improvisation under pressure. Take the skills of a pickpocket, add the frustrations of a failed farmer. Stir in the muscle of an ex-soldier, and you had yourself a man pretending to be an assassin without any actual roadmap. The road taught only one thing: Your mistakes will kill you faster than any enemy could. And with life balanced so perilously, the only hope of reaching a target lay not in strength or weapons, but in disguises and improvised strategies to slip within striking distance. Because no matter how sharp or not your knife was, it meant nothing if you never got past the door in the first place. So killers were never really bred in schools or raised within secret orders. They were forged in hunger, in battles with no wages, in alleys too narrow to breathe. And every one of them walked forward with shaky hands, stumbling toward the terrible knowledge that skill would never save them as much as sheer accident might. That was the strange, pathetic truth. The training of assassins was luck mixed with borrowed tools, and the classroom was wherever a first attempt ended. Most didn't survive the exam. The few who did passed not because they mastered anything, but because fate hesitated for just long enough to let them walk away. So yes, forget rehearsed montages, grand traditions, or noble causes. Most assassins scraped by with a stolen knife, scraps of courage, and the vain hope that their first failure wouldn't also be their last breath. If you think survival was about knowing how to kill cleanly, you're mistaken. Survival was about outrunning those who saw you, hiding your face before rumors spread, and praying your luck didn't run out just yet. Which is why the real skill wasn't about stabbing at all, it was about tricking everyone else into letting you close enough to try. So they had to rely on disguises and improvisation to get anywhere near their victims. How did a peasant with a knife sneak past guards? Not with polished masks or clever wigs, that's for sure. You weren't rifling through a chest of costumes like an actor backstage. You were rummaging through discarded rags, stealing a monk's robe off a laundry line, or borrowing a servant's apron when no one looked. The word disguise in this period didn't mean transforming yourself into someone else with flair. It meant putting just enough cloth between who you were and who you pretended to be, hoping no one stared too closely. The average assassin had no formal training in camouflage. He had desperation, scraps of clothing, and a shaky plan that usually boiled down to, if I look like I belong, maybe I can walk a few steps further. Picture it. You're a common farmer who one day picks up a kitchen knife for reasons beyond cooking. You wear a patched brown jerkin and muddy boots that mark you as nobody of importance. Standing outside the castle gate, you'd be turned away instantly. But if you could get your hands on a rough servant's tunic, a shirt faded from endless washing, perhaps still carrying the smell of grease or ale, you might pass as a scullery worker. And if you knew the right hour, when carts rolled in with sacks of flour and barrels of salted fish, you could slip into the line. No clever passwords, no secret tunnels, just a trick of blending in at the right moment. The problem is towns in the Middle Ages weren't sprawling metropolises where you could vanish among strangers. They were small, contained, and densely connected. A city gate guard often knew dozens of faces and noticed when someone was out of place. People gossiped so much that a newcomer could become the subject of whispers within hours. That meant your disguise had to carry you through people who were predisposed to notice things. If even one person squinted and muttered, "I don't recognize him," your chances dropped. Unlike the movies, you couldn't vanish into a faceless crowd. Everyone was somebody's cousin, neighbor, or employer's helper. That constant risk of recognition made every step like testing thin ice. To really understand this, imagine walking into a castle kitchen pretending to be a scullery boy. You've scavenged an oily apron from the rubbish and tied it over your chest. Your hands are dirty enough, at least, to look like they've been scrubbing pots. Now you push a door open and step into a kitchen smelling of boiled meat and wood smoke. The place is bustling. Actual scullery boys carry water jugs, cooks bark orders, servants rush with trays. These people all know each other because they work the same grueling shifts day after day. The moment someone new walks in, questions form silently in their eyes. Do they recognize you? Is there a new hire they weren't told about? If no one speaks up, you might slide through unnoticed. If someone challenges you, ask simply, "Who sent you?" Your plan collapses, you have no answer. And these disguises lacked finesse. There were no stage paints to age your face, no powders that softened features, no trick beards in a drawer ready for use. Makeup didn't exist for workers like this, nor did anyone carry a wardrobe chest of rolls to switch between. The average disguise was a smelly shirt that didn't fit, or a robe stolen from a heap of laundry drying near a monastery. The stitches betrayed their origin, the colors suggested status, and even the dirt patterns could tell the observant eye whether that apron had ever seen real kitchen work. Guards weren't fools. They saw through laziness, and many were paid specifically to notice intruders in borrowed clothes. That's where the added layer of prevention came in. Doormen existed explicitly to stop a nobody from wandering too far inside. In places of wealth, checkpoints weren't subtle. A porter asked questions, sometimes too many. A chamber guard crossed spears and demanded names. Food tasters, cupbearers, and household spies circulated constantly. Nobles lived in a paranoid state, always aware that enemies didn't just attack on open fields. They appeared at banquets, slipped into chambers, or lurked in courtyards. So households built tier after tier of human walls designed to catch imposters. As soon as you slipped into stolen garb, you weren't just dodging servants. You were fighting against an entire system constructed around suspicion. Even in towns, suspicion was thick in the air. Monks, for example, carried reputations that made disguises tempting. Robes gave you the illusion of sacred belonging, the kind of presence that made guards hesitate before questioning. But robes also marked you for scrutiny. Clergy often knew each other by face, even from neighboring towns. Slip on a robe you'd stolen and you may gain some cover at low levels, but the moment you crossed paths with an actual monk, recognition risked disaster. He'd ask questions about your prayer house, your abbot, or a passage of scripture. Fail to answer, and his cry of fraud would bring every guard within hearing. What seemed like the simplest disguise turned instantly into a trap. Merchants offered other opportunities. Walking with a bundle of wares could sometimes excuse your presence in a bustling hall. Carrying cloth, salt, or cheap metal trinkets offered camouflage. But again, details tripped you up. Real merchants handled goods daily. They spoke the right jargon, carried the right tools. Pretend merchants exposed themselves by using the wrong wrappings, the wrong knots, or carrying goods that didn't match the region. A merchant missing a proper measure or scale brought suspicion. Just one guard glancing into your basket and finding a patched knife instead of marketable items could turn the attempt fatal. The disguise, then, was a fragile shield. It bought a few minutes of invisibility but cracked under even casual inspection. Nobles made matters worse by sprinkling spies among their own staff. Servants traded information in whispers, reporting strangers so they could curry favor with masters. This scatter of watching eyes meant your stolen apron wasn't only fooling a gate guard, it had to withstand 20 small acts of suspicion by servants, doormen, entertainers, and watchful wives of household officers. Every step was a test, and every test might be the one that revealed the odd patch of cloth or the nervous way you held a tray. Consider also the problem of behavior. Clothing was only half of a disguise. The rest was your posture, your walk, even your accent. A person raised in fields talked one way. A monk trained in cloisters spoke another. Subtle differences mattered. You could wear a cleric's robe and still blow your cover by forgetting which hand should hold the prayer beads, or by failing to dip your head at the right point in a greeting. A kitchen servant needed to know where pots hung or how to carry stacked trenchers without spilling. Fail those details and eyes narrowed. So the disguise wasn't just cloth. It demanded knowledge most desperate men never had. The risk of recognition in a tight-knit town couldn't be overstated. These weren't anonymous urban streets lit by gas lamps centuries later. These were small stone passages where each family had lived for generations. Residents noticed outsiders quickly. In modern terms, it would be like trying to walk unnoticed into a family reunion where everyone's related except you. That familiarity was weaponized to keep intruders away, and no disguise, no matter how carefully tied, could completely counter the scrutiny of eyes trained by daily routine. So what happened when it went wrong? The short answer: everything collapsed in seconds. Guards who tolerated your scrappy robe one moment clamped hands on you the next. Accusations flew loudly. Someone tugged at your stolen apron and revealed not the role you posed as but the stranger you were. Instant capture followed. In many cases, you wouldn't even get far enough to draw a weapon. A doorman's shout could summon armed men before you touched your target. And an accused intruder didn't earn the kindness of being asked to leave. They earned slaps, shackles, and rough interrogation in the courtyard. Sometimes the disguise carried you further. Sometimes no one cared enough to look closely. But those moments of luck were rare, and every assassin understood the gamble. A robe could help you slip into a hall, but if one monk or guard or maid questioned you, the illusion dissolved. And in this line of work, dissolution meant chains or death. Disguises then offered brief chances for amateurs to approach victims. But failure wasn't like losing work at the blacksmith or being fired from sweeping stables. Failure didn't send you home to try again another day. It meant you were pinned, shouted at, and paraded into punishment. Failure meant your role as assassin didn't end quietly in shadows. It ended in spectacle. Imagine trying to stab a lord missing, and suddenly realizing the whole household is on top of you. The clatter of boots on the floor, torches raised, shouts echoing through stone halls. There is no pause, no time to breathe, no chance to say, "Wait, let me try again." Everything turns in an instant from tense anticipation to violent chaos. The target thrashes away, guards pile in, servants scream, and you stand there with a blade that accomplished nothing except sealing your own fate. In a world with no rehearsals, no second attempts, this was the nightmare ending that most assassins faced sooner or later. And the terrifying part wasn't just the failure itself. It was what happened after the failure. The truth is, you didn't make backup plans. You couldn't. You didn't gather a squad of allies who'd pull you out if things went bad. It wasn't like a heist with an escape cart waiting outside and riders ready to fight off pursuers. You walked in alone, disguised badly, hoping you wouldn't be noticed, and you hoped to walk back out unnoticed. Once something went wrong, once the blade missed or the poison ended up in the wrong goblet, your plan disintegrated. The noble target had guards sworn to protect them in every room and servants loyal enough to scream for help. That meant as soon as you stumbled, you were trapped. No amount of running could outrun a castle locking its doors against you, or townsfolk eager to seize you before word spread that they failed in their duties. There was no rescue waiting in the shadows, no mentor to pull you up. There was only panic, then capture. Being captured didn't look anything like the quiet disappearances you see in fiction. Capture meant being flung onto the ground, iron shackles slammed over your wrists, a bag pulled across your head. And it didn't stop there. They didn't let you rot unnoticed in some cell. They wanted you interrogated loudly, painfully, in ways that squeezed out names and details. Torture wasn't a rumor, it was an expectation. The whole point was to drag from you who hired you, who helped you, who else might be plotting. You were never just punished, you were ripped apart for information first. In this cruel logic, you weren't even a man anymore. You were a talking tool being forced to spit out names until you had nothing left to give. The methods were gruesome. It could be strappado, where your arms were tied behind your back and you were hoisted upward until shoulder joints tore. It could be hot irons pressed close until the smell of your own body turned your stomach. Racks bent bones, boots crushed them, whips cut stripes across skin. They didn't need to make sense or show mercy because you weren't supposed to walk away. This wasn't about justice, it was theater. You became a warning sign in human form, a reminder that no hand could reach after nobles without snapping in the attempt. And once the information was squeezed out, whether accurate or invented in pain, what followed was worse. Execution came with a flourish. Hanging was common but rarely swift. A poor scaffold, a short rope, a knot tied poorly could mean you dangled half-strangled for minutes in public, twitching until you stopped moving. If your crime was seen as particularly daring or horrifying, they didn't stop at hanging. The punishment escalated. Quartering meant more than death. It meant your body dragged apart deliberately, symbolic in its violence, hacked into pieces that hung on gates or spiked above city walls. Severed heads were displayed facing every comer at a town's edge, rain washing over the empty sockets. You weren't only killed, you were turned into a symbol, your corpse positioned as a permanent display of authority. Even punishment by fire occurred. Sometimes the unlucky ones were bound to stakes and burned alive before crowds that cheered or jeered or stood in silence. Fire was spectacle of absolute control, and people walked away from it whispering to their children about the danger of crossing powers far above them. It was never really about you. It was about everyone else watching. Making sure no one else with a knife or desperate hunger would consider repeating your mistake. And the spectacle didn't always end with you. Failure could spill disaster outward to those closest to you. Investigation stretched back toward your family, your acquaintances. If a lord believed that your brother, your cousin, your wife even suspected your work, punishment could roll over them as well. Collective punishment was part of the fear. Families could be fined into starvation, exiled into wilderness, branded by association. If the case carried enough weight, relatives could be imprisoned or executed right alongside you. Failure, therefore, wasn't just yours. It was contagious. It spread like fire to burn the lives of anyone unlucky enough to share your roof or your name. And this wasn't hidden. Crowds were pulled in to watch, sometimes forced to attend. Noble households wanted the story of your suffering carried to every tavern stool and market square. It worked like a medieval billboard for deterrence. Your ruined body on a rope or wheel screamed one lesson for days, weeks, even months afterward. Don't try what he tried. A single failed assassin could frighten hundreds into obedience. That was the purpose, not just punishment. The punishment had always been secondary to the lesson. Knowing this, assassins lived in constant paranoia. Long before they failed, most of them already carried the weight of possible exposure. Every job was terrifying because you had to consider not only the chance of dying, but the chance of being dragged through torture, betrayed painfully, then paraded to your death. This fear hollowed them out. They withdrew from friends, spoke less, looked over shoulders constantly. Their lives were ringed by mistrust because they understood what would happen if they were caught. The horrors described so often in front of cheering crowds weren't stories to them. They were inevitabilities playing in the back of their minds each night. Even in the smallest jobs, the same fate could follow. You didn't actually need to come within inches of a crown to attract punishment. A wealthy merchant could be enough. A tax collector hated by everyone. A minor noble fighting a feud. Even an attempt against low officials, if discovered, could bring theatrical consequences. This was the life you gambled on. Hunger forced your hand into crime, and once you tried it, the punishment for failure ensured you almost never returned from it. There was no light penalty, no reform. Failure meant obliteration. But here's the most bitter piece. Even if you succeeded, even if the knife actually hit its mark, even if you slipped out before anyone grabbed you, that wasn't safety. Because the moment your job succeeded, you became just as much of a problem. You had knowledge that made you a liability. You knew who had hired you, why they wanted it done, and what coin had been promised. Protecting the secret meant you were suddenly expendable. The employer who smiled at you one night might quiet you the next, just to ensure no secrets leaked. Failure then erased assassins spectacularly in fire and rope. But success was no safer. In fact, it often meant your danger only doubled. You didn't escape the game by winning. You simply got pushed one step closer to being silenced permanently. The knife might land or slip, the disguise might hold or fall apart, but the end always bowed toward the same conclusion. You were doomed either way. And here is where this cruel loop closed. Because for assassins, there was never a clean outcome. Failure left you butchered in public squares. Success turned you into a loose end worth cutting off. There was no version of the story in which you reaped wealth and lived comfortably far into old age. Both paths ended at the same terminus, ruin, destruction, and oblivion. So when you imagine the household surging forward after your failed attack, think of the long chain it triggered. Capture, questions torn from your mouth, and violence unfolding in slow, painful stages. Think of the families trembling behind doors, afraid your capture might name them falsely. Think of the crowd forced to watch your body broken as if it were a play staged to drill obedience into hearts. That is what failure truly meant. Not just death for you, but a ripple of suffering used as a warning to all. And even when the knife struck true, the shadow over your head never shrank. Because even a perfect hit made the assassin a liability. You take the job, but does the payment ever arrive? That's the real question, and the cause of more sleepless nights than the thought of swinging at the end of a rope. You imagine a heavy pouch of coins handed over as soon as the task is done, but imagination collapses quickly in practice. Most of the time, you weren't given a bag of silver. You weren't even trusted with copper. Instead, someone slid across a small handful of coins up front, a kind of meager advance. Enough to convince you that the job was serious, yet never enough to actually support you for long. The rest, they promised, would come after you finished. That promise was about as reliable as the weather. Partial payment became common practice because employers didn't want to waste money on men who might get caught before lifting a blade. From their perspective, you were the risk. You could be killed, captured, or end up telling someone else the plan. Why risk paying in full if your work was more likely to produce a scandal than a clean result? And so, the assassin became trapped in an arrangement where he had to gamble his life first before collecting anything more than crumbs. The cruel reality being sometimes there was no second payment at all. You can picture how vague these agreements were. There weren't written contracts drafted neatly with signatures and seals. Courts weren't an option, and laws never protected hired killers. Instead, everything was spoken in back rooms, whispered over cups of wine, wrapped in deliberately unclear language. "Payment will be given once the matter is done," was the sort of line tossed around. But what does "done" mean? Dead in the street? Dead but never identified? Dead with proof in the form of a severed ear or lock of hair? The less precise the contract, the more room the employer had to wiggle out of responsibility. And wiggle they often did. The betrayal could play out in several ways. Sometimes, after the assassin risked everything and somehow managed to survive, the employer simply disappeared. The tavern where you first met him closed its shutters. The merchant's stall was empty. The noble who whispered orders vanished into his manor and claimed he had no part in anything. Doors closed, and silence answered your demands for the full sum. Other times, employers took a darker route. Once the deed was done, they decided you were inconvenient. Maybe the target's allies began to ask questions. Maybe whispers about your employer's role threatened to rise above a mumble. What better way to wipe the slate clean than to erase the assassin himself? That meant sending someone else to find you in the same alleys you had once prowled in search of your own victims. Imagine the paranoia baked into every job. You needed the payment because starvation remained your constant companion. But even the man promising payment was also the man who had most reason to get rid of you after the act. You weren't just employed. You were a loose thread in his tapestry of secrets. All it took was one tug at that thread for his world to unravel. To prevent that, clipping you out of existence became cheaper than reaching for his purse. In this bleak economy, your patron was actually your greatest threat. The hand that fed you was the same hand that might point to your destruction. What made it worse was the complete absence of recourse. If a carpenter cheated you, maybe you could appeal to a local court. If a tenant cheated the landlord, there was at least a public record of dispute. But you, as a hired killer, carried no such defense. You couldn't walk into a guild hall and complain about late payment. You couldn't petition a town council for fair treatment. Your profession put you outside protection, which meant betrayal wasn't extraordinary. It was guaranteed. Every job carried the implicit possibility that you would be swindled before the coin ever reached your hand. The cruelest twist came in the form of false contracts. Men in power often set traps using fake jobs as bait. Sometimes they wanted to test a suspicious knight, retainer, or wanderer rumored to be for hire. They would stage a request, promise coin for a killing, but the real aim was to see if you accepted. If you did, punishment followed swiftly, not payment. Other times, so-called employers offered impossible targets as a test of loyalty, daring you to attempt what couldn't be done, only to expose you afterward as a fraud or traitor. Each time, the assassin carried the danger of stepping straight into staged betrayals cleverly arranged to eliminate men like him without lifting the sword themselves. The economy of assassination relied entirely on trust, except trust didn't exist. The employer assumed you might botch the job, run away, or betray him under torture. You assumed your employer might cheat you, expose you, or erase you. This mutual suspicion poisoned every step of the business. Payment often had less to do with actual coins and more to do with timing, silence, and luck. If the employer believed you were useful for more than one task, maybe he kept you alive to use again. But once he feared your voice would be heard by the wrong ears, no amount of promises mattered. Betrayal was always in the air, lingering like smoke. Think of this cycle day to day. You walk to a tavern corner at night, meet a man with a proposition, and accept a handful of low-value coins. You risk life and soul on this assignment, pouring what little wit and nerve you have into reaching the target. Against the odds, you succeed. And then, when every nerve is shot, When every corner feels like it has a guard behind it, you stumble back for your reward, only to find absence. Or worse, not absence but ambush. That's when you recognize the grim arithmetic. You earned not profit but danger. Success sharpened the knife that now pointed back at you. Some assassins tried to play clever by demanding more up front, but this rarely worked. Employers balked, claiming it was too risky. Others attempted to secure pledges of more substantial value. A trinket, a piece of jewelry, a written statement. But these carried even more danger. Hold an item as collateral, and now you had proof connecting the employer. That proof made your death even more urgent. So, ironically, the stronger the arrangement looked in your favor, the more likely it was that your end would come swiftly after. You lived in a paradox where security ensured danger and danger ensured insecurity. The more jobs you took, the worse it became. Each new employer meant one more person out there who knew your name, your face, your habits. Each fresh promise of coin meant another possible betrayal. Instead of stacking wealth, you stacked invisible enemies. The longer you survived, the more people had cause to erase you. And far from wealth, this accumulation of suspicion left you thin, desperate, and jumpy. Your body aged under the strain. Hunger left your bones brittle. Fear hollowed your sleep until you woke at the sound of every rat scratching nearby. You kept coins hidden in corners, never certain if you would even live long enough to spend them. The tavern girl who used to smile at you began to turn her face away, fearing being linked with you could cost her life. Old acquaintances from your soldiering days ignored you, spooked by the rumor that you worked in shadows. You didn't keep friends. You didn't keep stability. You kept only the paranoia that the next employer's hand would be the last one you ever shook. All this points to a bitter conclusion. Success didn't bring wealth or glory, it brought more risk. The knife you carried never fed you as much as it starved your chance of living. Even when you managed to finish a job cleanly, even when you held up your end, your employer often prepared a final reward that looked nothing like a bag of coins. It looked like betrayal, ambush, or silence. You ended not richer but poorer. Poorer in trust, poorer in community, and poorer in spirit. And so the assassin's economy reduced him to little more than a shifting liability, shuffled between hunger and danger without ever breaking free. Payment might come once if he was lucky, but luck never repeated forever. Men like him were paid only in fleeting survival, and the dishonesty of employers kept their fate sealed from the moment they agreed to a job. No wonder then that assassins carried not only knives but also false names, half-recited backstories, and constant readiness to abandon everything. The coin you never collected didn't matter as much as your ability to run. Because after work like this, after watching employers vanish or hearing whispers of a new killer sent to replace you, the real trade wasn't violence at all. It was the endless grinding art of survival by disappearance. So no matter the path, whether cheated or used or erased, the result was the same. Assassins didn't stockpile wealth. They stockpiled fear. They traded the promise of coin for the reality of paranoia. And that paranoia forced them into the only business they ever mastered, leaving behind names, disguises, and lives as often as they shed blood. This left assassins in a cycle of running, hiding, and abandoning identities. An endless pursuit not of money, but of one more day alive. What does it feel like to know your only employer wants you gone? Not just gone from his hall or his memory, but erased completely, body and all, before anyone can trace a single detail back to him. That knowledge seeps into you slowly until every glance feels like a trap. You can't share a mug in a tavern without wondering if the man serving you has been bribed. You can't sleep without hearing footsteps you imagine are closing in. Being a killer for hire meant you weren't just a danger to others, you were the greatest danger to yourself. Once the job was over, your employer no longer saw you as a servant. He saw you as a liability, a loose end waiting to unravel his precious secrets. You weren't trusted enough to keep breathing. Your heartbeat itself became evidence against him, so in his mind, the cleanest solution was cutting it off. And you carried that weight everywhere you walked, knowing that at any hour someone might take the same job you once took. Only this time, you were the target. The pressure of living like this is difficult to imagine in comfortable terms. You might picture paranoia today as checking if the door is locked twice, or jumping at a suspicious noise in the dark. For an assassin, the paranoia was awake and blistering every single second. There was no lock good enough. There was no door thick enough. You walked knowing someone somewhere had perhaps already been paid to follow your shadow. And the pressure didn't lift in daylight. A crowd didn't make you feel safer. It made you feel cornered. Those faces weren't a shield. They were witnesses who might remember you when the law came asking. The pounding chest, the tight stomach, the constant awareness of exits, it wasn't passing anxiety. It was your daily diet. And the worst part was how everyone else responded. You couldn't slink quietly into underworld circles hoping for solidarity. Criminals and thieves, men who lived outside the law, still kept their distance. Even they considered assassins untouchable. You didn't hear laughter when you joined their tables. You heard scratching silence and wooden mugs set down slower as if everyone wanted to melt away. A tavern once filled with chatter broke off like a sudden storm ended it. Words dried in mouths, eyes avoided yours, and the people who once called you neighbor found pressing matters elsewhere. You didn't have to be caught in the act. The rumor alone was enough to exile you in the middle of the street. Think of walking into a tavern after weeks on the run. The door creaks, the fire glows, the smell of stale ale hangs in the air. For a moment, everyone looks up because everyone knows everyone. It only takes half a second for recognition to ignite. Nobody needs proof. Nobody needs to ask. They've heard whispers of a man fitting your shape, your hair, the way your eyes move. Now they've placed you. Chairs scrape back. Not to fight, not to chase you out, but to avoid contact. Because speaking to you was dangerous. Just meeting your gaze was dangerous. Anyone too friendly with you risked being chained beside you should guards swoop in tomorrow. So within minutes, you sit alone at a table, facing mugs of ale cooling untouched in a room that no longer feels warm. Even old ties didn't survive. You might try to track down a friend from your soldiering days, the man you once shielded in battle or shared rations with on campaign. Maybe you thought loyalty would hold. Instead, he stares through you flatly, refuses to answer, and turns back to his dice game. Maybe he doesn't even bother with words, just the grim shake of a head before walking out. That's when you realize it wasn't just enemies cutting you off. It was everyone. People knew speaking with you was like touching iron heated on the forge. The burn reached them instantly. What more certain proof of isolation can there be than watching friendships built in hardship dissolve with nothing more than your shadow crossing the room? It didn't help that superstition coiled around assassins as tightly as iron shackles. In an age when miracles, curses, and omens shaped daily choices, you were seen not simply as dangerous but as unnatural. Rumors painted assassins not as starving peasants, but as men touched by infernal powers. People whispered you were marked by demons given animal eyes at night, or that your tongue dripped poison with each word. Others described you as men who could crawl along ceilings like lizards, or who cried no tears because their souls were dry. children were warned not to look at you, not to listen to you, or the curse would pass on to them. These wild exaggerations spread faster than facts, and they stuck harder. If you were already seen as cursed, then people could treat you with cruelty while justifying their fear. They didn't just isolate you, they believed touching you, even in kindness, would stain them permanently. Imagine the weight of hearing whispers behind you, seeing gestures people made to ward off evil the moment your shadow crossed their threshold. A woman pulling her child closer, a priest clutching his beads tighter. The sound of spitting in the dust after you passed, as if your step poisoned the ground. All of it added volume to an isolation already loud enough in your ears. You were made into a monster others could define themselves against. They were upright because you were damned. They slept secure because they believed you wandered sleepless, cursed forever. Whether you believed it or not, you couldn't escape the myth people fed each other with lazy certainty. And with every day, that growing mass of suspicion destroyed any chance of blending back into normal life. People remembered faces in towns where communities rarely saw strangers. They remembered scars, tics, postures. You couldn't shave your beard and hope to pass unnoticed. You couldn't change your clothes and assume anonymity in the next village. Someone always remembered something, a crooked tooth, a limp, the odd tilt of your head. And rumor tied your features to words like killer or butcher. Even if you tried to live as a farmhand, suspicion followed. When a neighbor's chicken went missing, eyes turned on you. When bad luck struck a crop, whispers named you as the cause. People wanted scapegoats, and you fit the role more neatly each time. The result was a forced kind of migration. Not once, not twice, but endlessly. You couldn't settle in a town, find steady work, build a shack, or start a family. Roots meant recognition, and recognition meant exposure. So you moved constantly, stepping away after weeks before eyes turned sharper. You carried minimal possessions, often whatever could fit in a sack slung over the same hunched back. Beds never lasted long enough to soften. You might start in a small hut near a mill, only to disappear at dawn before anyone marked your habits too strongly. A wandering existence became your only lifestyle, but not the free adventure of a traveler. This was exile, repeated endlessly, and the punishment was clear enough. It wasn't only the rope at the gallows awaiting you eventually. It was an entire life smothered into invisibility. You were starved of connection, of conversation, of trust. Your footsteps left no welcome anywhere. Each passing day felt less like life and more like a long erasure spread across miles of road. You were there, but you weren't supposed to be. Each community thrust you away, each tavern refused your presence, each friend shut their door until the weight of silence defined you more than any other word could. So what did it feel like? It felt like being erased while still alive. The town's eyes looked through you. Your employer waited for chance to cut you down, and every rumor about curses or demonic blood chipped away at whatever fragments of humanity remained. In the end, execution wasn't just the drop at the gallows or the fire of torches. It was the long, living execution of exile. You walked roads that tolerated your footsteps but offered nothing more. You breathed air that marked you already as guilty. Your punishment then stretched far beyond the scaffold. It was the endless invisibility of a man treated as ghost while still warm-blooded. You couldn't join society, you weren't allowed to step outside it in peace either. You existed in the jagged space between lonely, hunted, unwelcome, and always expecting vanishing steel from behind. This was life as a liability, unbearable pressure, constant suspicion and punishment long before a noose ever met your neck. And with that reality, you learned something vital. The act of killing was only half the job. The endless hours after mattered just as much. Because once you realized survival meant turning invisible, you discovered escape planning wasn't a choice or a bonus. It was as crucial as the assassination itself. The most important part of the job wasn't the kill, it was the exit. Stabbing, poisoning, strangling. Any fool with a half-sharp blade or a pinch of nightshade could attempt it once. But what came after separated those who lived to see another sunrise from those who ended up swinging in the market square. Getting out, vanishing, becoming someone else by the next morning, that kept you breathing. The actual act of murder was only half the equation. The real test of survival began the very second the victim slumped to the ground. That was when boots thundered on stone, doors slammed shut, and the walls seemed to squeeze closer around you. If you hadn't thought carefully about your escape before you even started, then you'd already written your death sentence. Prearranged routes made the difference between vanishing and rotting behind iron bars. You didn't walk toward a noble or a merchant without already knowing how you'd walk away. That meant arranging a horse in advance, not tethered lazily near a gate, but hidden where only you could find it. Fast enough not to collapse after a few miles, yet cheap enough that losing it would sting less than losing your life. Horses were valuable. Lending or selling one to a shady figure drew suspicion immediately. So many assassins turned instead to boats. A waiting boat at dusk offered a chance to slip along rivers that cut through towns and countryside alike. One moment you were a shadow in stone alleys, the next you were gone into black water, your silhouette blurred against reeds. A decent boatman willing to keep his mouth shut became more valuable than any blade on your belt, but trust tied around escape routes could strangle you just as quick. That horse might not be waiting when you got to the hiding spot. That boatman you bribed with 2 handfuls of coins could just as easily sell you to the guards and pocket his fee twice. Betrayal was easier than loyalty when punishments for sheltering criminals meant ropes or broken bones. At any moment, the lifeline you built could transform into a trap. You rushed into darkness, chasing the promise of escape, only to find soldiers waiting where your rescue should have been. In a trade already packed with fear, this added yet another layer of paranoid dread. You couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to save you. Geography, too, shaped every possible outcome. If you planned badly, the land itself betrayed you. Mountains swallowed fugitives if you had the strength to climb, but one twisted ankle and the peaks left you stranded for soldiers to find. Rivers offered hiding places and fast transport, but floods, currents, and sharp-eyed boatmen worked against you just as often. The wrong choice of route didn't just slow you down, it killed. Even the narrow alleys of medieval cities held double edges. A twisting lane could swallow you into shadows, but it could pinch shut like a trap, choking you into corners with no way out. Each step across stone wasn't simply a path. It was a choice either towards safety or disaster. Adapting your very appearance became just as critical as deciding whether to run east or west. No assassin could rely on a single outfit for long. If you killed in a servant's apron, you couldn't keep wearing it as you fled. The grease stains and stiff cloth marked you to anyone looking, so you stripped in shadows, stealing the cloak of a drunkard or yanking clothes from a washing line. Sometimes it meant scraping your face with dull blades to remove your beard in one swift decision. Sometimes it meant covering your head entirely beneath a hood, pretending to be a pilgrim trudging through with dust and blisters as excuses for not speaking. Quick disguises weren't glamorous, they were immediate needs, improvised from whatever scraps you touched. Shaving your face was one thing. Changing your whole story was another layer. A sudden vow of pilgrimage could open doors. Disguises alone could not. Wandering pilgrims appeared constantly in medieval Europe, men and women trudging to shrines, surviving off charity. Cloaked in dirt and humility, they blended into roads and inns without raising suspicion. For an assassin, grabbing a walking stick and mumbling about a distant saint could be enough to buy safety for another leg of the journey. You had no official papers required, just convincing dust on your clothes and the silence of someone walking long, miserable miles for divine mercy. Hiding behind religion gave you a mask made of faith, and faith in those days carried weight. Even armed guards hesitated to challenge quickly. Take one picture. You finish the act, stumble away, heart rattling in your chest. 10 minutes later, you stand on a monastery road in shabby gray cloth, head bowed, muttering a half-remembered prayer. Guards ride past, glancing without care because all they see is another weary soul dragging himself toward holy ground. Nobody notices the knife tucked under your belt or the blood-stained shape just out of sight. That's how fragile escape could be. 10 minutes of disguise separating a corpse under torches from a free man stumbling across miles of gravel. What you lacked in craft, you made up with improvisation. And always, always, undercutting your plans was the chilling thought that someone else might be following. Even a perfect escape crumbled if another assassin had been hired in secret. Not to finish the victim you missed, but to hunt you down after a job completed. The same tricks you used against your quarry were doubled back onto you. That meant disguises, escape routes, safe houses. All needed reinvention constantly. You couldn't linger because wherever you lingered, someone else could strike. This sickly mirror of killers chasing killers defined the paranoia of the work. Each escape demanded creativity to the point of desperation. Run too far and you collapsed from hunger because carrying food slowed you down. Hide too long, and the very family offering you bread could betray you at dawn. Even if you reached another town, you needed to invent an entirely new history before nightfall. You might pose 1 week as a mason's helper, another week as a passing peddler with a basket you didn't truly own. Each reinvention drained you, stripped away whatever scraps of identity you once had, until the only consistent fact became that you existed solely to avoid being seen. Long before the authorities broke your body, your endless reinvention fractured your sense of self. The job's success was measured not by how quiet the daggers slipped, not by the efficiency of poison in a wine goblet, but by how quickly your feet carried you afterward. Running became the true craft, the deepest experience carved into your bones. Assassins didn't live on artistry of death. They lived briefly on the artistry of flight. Surviving another week meant throwing away your name yet again, swapping boots, finding another falsified story, finding a path through geography sharper than blades themselves. The kill might last a clenched heartbeat, but the escape lasted every following one you ever hoped to see. So in the end, this was the cruel paradox of the work. The killing earned you coin sometimes. The escape drained you of every ounce of energy and trust. And if you managed to pull off both, you weren't safe, only buying a delay. Because running, cleverness, disguises, all the frantic reinvention in the world, they only push the noose a little further down the road. No amount of running made you invisible forever. So the lesson carved itself brutally into every fugitive's mind. You didn't live by killing well. You lived for however many months or years fate allowed, by running faster, lying smoother, and hiding better than the people already waiting to catch you. But even the fastest legs and the cleverest disguises couldn't outrun time. The exits delayed disaster, they never prevented it. And so, every fugitive learned that no matter how carefully they arranged escape routes, no matter how quickly they shed one identity for the next, running only delayed the inevitable. What was the retirement plan for assassins? There wasn't one. No countryside cottage, no grandchildren gathered by the hearth, no quiet years of telling old stories by the fire. If you were lucky enough to breathe beyond your 30s or 40s, it wasn't because the world let you grow old. It was because you somehow managed to dodge everyone who wanted you gone. That sort of luck ran out faster than candles on a stormy night. Most killers never saw gray hair. Their story didn't wander into comfortable age. It ended abruptly in a ditch, on a rope, or in a river few remembered to fish bodies from. Longevity wasn't part of this line of work. You aged only in paranoia and hunger, and even that was rare. Imagine your bones creaking after endless nights on dirt mattresses or rolled in cloaks by the roadside. You're not admired as a seasoned professional. You're seen as an embarrassment to erase, a danger still breathing. Every day you grow older, you grow weaker. You can't run as quickly. Your hands shake when you reach for a blade. But you're still carrying secrets. And secrets mean someone, somewhere, still considers you a problem. That's not a retirement plan. That's a death sentence with bad handwriting, delayed until it can be carried out cleanly. Few men should live like this, but that was the reality. Those who somehow clung to survival didn't enjoy it. They existed like rats in timber shacks or leaning sheds on the edge of towns. You lived in the shadows of markets but never joined the crowd. You couldn't sit at a tavern table laughing, raising mugs, trading gossip. You kept to side alleys and broken wooden stools, picking crusts from bowls left cold. People kept away. They knew your shadow as well as your name. Even if years passed since your last task, silence followed you into every corner. You became that strange figure everyone whispered about but nobody touched. And the worst part, your own thoughts never let you rest. Even forgotten assassins lived in paranoia. Nights weren't nights. They were long hours of listening for the wrong step outside your door. Sleep came in fragments. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, broken every time a fox howled or a cart rumbled nearby. You never relaxed fully, not when sleep could collapse into discovery. A knock meant trouble. A shout meant the inevitable had finally tracked you down. Even in obscurity, you never earned calm. You carried the fear carved into you from the very first job all the way until the last miserable breath. Hunger gnawed when coin trickled out. Drinking yourself insensible risked speaking wrongly, so instead you shrank into a hollow ghost, half living until memory failed you and someone finally noticed you again. Think about the myths you've heard. All those stories of legendary killers who left enemies terrified, whose names stretched across lands like shadows over fields. That mythical figure didn't exist in practice. What existed was an old man choking on bread in an alley, a nameless corpse slumped outside town walls, a skeleton half covered by weeds where no one bothered to bury him. That's the real ending. The so-called legends faded into dirt and dust the same as every other desperate peasant or soldier thrown from notice. It wasn't glory. It wasn't infamy. It was quiet vanishing, made more pathetic by how complete the silence was afterward. History itself helped erase them. No chronicler wrote long passages about assassins. Why would they? Kings filled volumes, queens demanded ink, battles received songs. Assassins slipped through one night and never earned a poem. They left no memoirs, no transformations of themselves into heroes. What scraps remain arrive not as their voice, but as warning sermons, friars passing judgment, legal records documenting a hanging. The profession erased its own memory, not deliberately but naturally, because to live as an assassin meant to live outside preservation. What history remembers are roles with names and structures. Guilds, merchants, clergy. Assassins had no guilds. They had no carved stones recognizing their years. Their memory leaked away faster than their blood did. This silence was itself a punishment. To die without a mark, without a gravestone, without anyone telling stories after, that robbed existence of continuity. Assassins feared the rope, yes, but worse, they feared meaningless vanishing. Because all human beings cling to being remembered, even miserably. Assassins were denied it. You can count on one hand the faint, untrustworthy tales that survived centuries. The rest are dust, bones scattered under fields where farmers planted new seeds. Their profession didn't simply kill individuals. It evaporated their traces completely. Consider the burden pressing down as you aged. Hunger, loneliness, and the paranoia of wandering chipped at your mind steadily. You might walk from village to town, never pausing longer than nights or weeks. Each step wore down your shoes. Each night of broken rest gnawed at your body. Soon you weren't fast enough to run from guards, weren't sharp enough to notice subtle danger. Your own paranoia turned inward. Was that cough yours or someone spying behind the wall? Was that beggar limping near you or tailing you? Your mind doubled back on itself so often that truth and suspicion blurred. Old assassins were less men than hollow skins, exhausted by ceaseless self-defense. The body bore scars just as much as the mind. Malnutrition bent backs early. Hands stiffened from years of carrying blades, slings, ropes. Teeth broke and rotted without reliable food. Each loss reduced you, made you easier to notice, while also making you harder to recover from any flight. The constant relocation weakened your ties to everything that anchored human strength. Friends, food, community, sleep. Burned out and half-starved, most assassins didn't fall in battle or struggle. They simply collapsed wandering roads, another nameless body ready to be shoveled aside. That's how they disappeared. No heroic last stand, no solemn burial, just quiet fading. One day, people whispered a name at tavern corners. A week later, no one mentioned it anymore. A month later, he was forgotten completely. So many accounts describe assassins simply vanishing. Not captured dramatically, not executed before cheering crowds. They just walked away into forests or mountains and never returned. Did wolves get them? Did hunger? Did they choke on stream water somewhere alone? Nobody cared enough to mark the ending. Silence swallowed them the way Earth swallowed hundreds of other nameless humans. In rare cases, memory clawed someone back into light decades later. An assassin thought forgotten might settle far in another town under a craft, maybe as carpenter or wanderer carrying trinkets. For a time, anonymity held. Then someone's suspicion stirred the ashes. A scar was noticed. A story was repeated. A slip resulted in recognition. And even 20 or 30 years later, punishment reached backward across time. Old age didn't excuse you. You could be dragged up gray-haired toward the gallows, punished not for who you were then, but who you had been long before. Few professions remained so unforgiving. Even shepherds forgotten for debt might be left at peace in old age. Not killers, not men marked as liabilities. Their past carried claws that reached out no matter the decades separating it. The end game held no variation. You didn't succeed into wealth. You didn't reach comfort after dangerous years, as if danger was only a bridge to stability. The end game always revolved around disappearance. Obscurity replaced glory. The proud myths painted over the centuries were artistic inventions pretending to beauty and work that carried none. The plain truth was this: almost every assassin ended erased by rope, by hunger, or by neglect. They carried their work like a slow, burning fuse that burned even after the blood dried. When it finished, nothing remained to mark their name. Look around at the picture. Fewer assassins reached old age than nearly any other group in society. Not because their tasks were so daring, but because their lives were poisoned by fear long after the act was done. Isolation ensured no one cared to help them. Poverty ensured no one could afford to shield them. Betrayal ensured even employers turned on them eventually. What awaited was not a quiet orchard or cottage. What awaited was shadows, hunger, exposure, and empty ground without a marker. So if you looked for a retirement plan, you found nothing. Each day alive was as far ahead as the future stretched. There was no account to collect, no apprentices to care for, no family to guard you safely. The only pension granted to these men was the certainty of suffering followed by the inevitability of vanishing. Their presence faded as surely as their footfalls clicked into silence down forgotten roads. And as they shrank, the world readily abandoned them. No songs, no laughter, no graves, only a hollow absence where their lives once sat unsteadily. And that's the full picture. The end game was not glory, it was not fame, it was not even infamy, it was simply nothingness. Disappearance into quiet, dust, and suspicion long after the body gave up. That's the lesson hiding at the end of all those whispered attempts, all those blades carried down alleys. You don't remember their names today because none lasted long enough to leave behind anything to remember. Which in its own way brings us back to the lesson history leaves for us. So here's the point. The assassin's story was never about mastery or honor. It wasn't clever men building legacies in the shadows. It was hunger, fear, and survival twisted into violent jobs that ended with rope, fire, or silence. Kings were recorded in chronicles, queens carved into memory, but the killers forgotten them, left no stone, no song, nothing at all. So yes, remember, myths are polished lies. Reality was desperation. Tonight, maybe that's enough to ease you. Your mattress, your walls, your locked door. They are safer than any assassin's hiding place ever was. Sleep comes easier knowing that.